Trails of Cold Steel 2's overall narrative is very engaging and interesting. But while every chapter has its amazing moments, none quite left a mark as deep as Aboard the Pantagruel, which is labeled as an intermission by the game and treated as a mini chapter of sorts. Before we move further, let's talk about what an intermission is in this context. An intermission refers to a break from the main story, or in other words, a section in the narrative in which the main story takes a rest and makes no direct progress. However, that doesn't necessarily make it purposeless. In this video, I'm going to talk about what makes Aboard the Pantagruel engaging and meaningful, and how it fits into the bigger picture of the main story. First, let's take a look at where this chapter is positioned in the story. Aboard the Pantagruel is the physical link between chapters 1 and 2 of Trails of Cold Steel 2. On an extremely broad and simplistic level, this chapter traces the steps from how Class 7 go from their state of uncertainty in Ymir to their state of certainty on the Courageous. But this video is about the details of that journey. This video will be divided into 3 parts, analyzing the narrative flow from a broad point of view, exploring the minute details from a deeper point of view, and then a summary of how it all affects the bigger picture. At 2 hours long, Aboard the Pantagruel is just the right length as a mini chapter, in the context of the overall length of the game. Furthermore, it is cutscene heavy but never lingers too long on any conversation, all the while feeding tiny but important tidbits of information to both Reen and the player. However, the most important factor regarding the narrative flow is the element of surprise, and how the chapter utilizes it to keep the player engaged. This chapter can be divided into 5 sections, and I'll explain how each of these sections not only contains standalone surprises, but also how it subverts the expectations set up by the previous section. So the chapter starts at a time of uncertainty in the story. That is when Class 7 have just reunited and are deciding on their next course of action. Their reunion is cut extremely short as the head of the Noble Alliance, Duke Cayenne, and his major affiliates arrive on the Pantagruel to disrupt it. And after Class 7 loses the ensuing battle, Reen is asked, or rather threatened, to come aboard the Pantagruel to discuss the idea of him joining the Noble Alliance. Reen agrees without much resistance, boards the Pantagruel, and that's how the chapter begins. It catches the player completely off guard by immediately and viscerally breaking the reunion of our heroes that we have spent 30 to 40 hours to achieve. And to top that, Reen has been taken into the enemy's den, which is basically uncharted territory. This acts as the first surprise, and as a player, I have no idea what's actually going to happen to Reen, which builds my intrigue. However, as soon as Reen is on the ship and has a conversation with the antagonists, it becomes clear that they are intent on presenting a rational point of view to him in terms of which side he should choose in the war, instead of threatening him to make their desired choice. And they make a decent argument. Decent enough to make Reen give serious thought to their offer. From the player's point of view, the question has now changed from what's going to happen to Reen to, well, perhaps not what choice he's going to make, but rather how he'll justify the choice he does make, since the opposition's offer holds some water logically. This early assurance that Reen is going to be safe and treated well on this ship completely changes the original question of intrigue, and that acts as the second surprise. Then, the next morning, with Reen still mulling over his options, he is greeted by Crow, who is willing to have a cordial, friendly conversation with him. He cooks food for him, and when pushed, even goes as far as telling his own backstory to Reen. The end of the first game leaves a bad taste in the mouth regarding Crow, and he is hostile when he fights Reen in Ymir as well. So, his friendliness here comes as a surprise. As it turns out, it's not only him, but the rest of the antagonists on the ship are not hostile towards Reen either, and that some of them are even affectionate. which again is unexpected given how hostile and violent our previous interactions with them have been. However, it not only makes sense for them to be friendly towards a potential ally, but also shows that they are, at the end of the day, human beings as well, and they are just as capable of showing human emotions as the protagonists are. That being said, the cool thing here is that the game never justifies their actions, and you also never once forget that you are interacting with the people on the other side of the war. The antagonists also never reveal too much about themselves. They are not your buddies. But anyway, having proper and sensible conversations with the villains is kind of an alien concept, and it's surprising that Falcom managed to pull it off in a way that felt organic and believable. However, the biggest surprise is yet to come. Reen finds Alfin staying in the special guest room on the ship. He's been looking for her and Elise for almost the entirety of the game. They have an emotional reunion, but when Alfin tells Reen why Duke Cayenne has been keeping her by his side, and when he realizes that she has been acting against her own feelings for the greater good, he falls into a deeper dilemma regarding which side he should choose in the war. Especially since Elise is still far away from him and in the Noble Alliance's clutches. He wonders aloud whether he should betray his own beliefs and choose to side with the Noble Alliance to save Elise. Elise, to whom he owes so much. But then, Alfin knocks some sense into him, and we get to experience one of the most emotional moments in the series so far, and Reen finally manages to accept himself and other people's love for him. I think the fact that hours and hours of character development for Reen climaxed in the Pantagruel of all places is a surprise in itself. But even more surprising is that Reen actually honored Elise's devotion to him with something concrete and deeply symbolic of their relationship, since she had been built as a devoted but underappreciated little sister archetype since the first game. But then again, the person that Reen had been holding himself back for was Elise, so she was the only one who could help him move forward. The final surprise in the chain is the sudden appearance of Prince Olivert and Victor Arcade on the Courageous, along with our other allies, to save the day for Reen. The ongoing battle ends in a stalemate, following which the party departs on the Red Airship. While the chapter started with doubt and uncertainty, it ends on a more positive note as Class 7 are finally able to chart their course of action once they are aboard the Courageous. The element of surprise is one of the major narrative weapons that the Trails of Cold Steel series utilizes in its storytelling, and I feel like Aboard the Pantagruel is the prime example of the game's writer's understanding and strong grasp over how to balance subversion of expectations with a sense of believability and naturality. Each section sets up an expectation of what the chapter is about, which then gets subverted the moment the next section rolls around, and the narrative flow is natural and never feels forced either. So we have talked about the flow of the narrative in this chapter, but does it have enough meat in the details to keep up with the engaging flow? I think it has more than enough. Aboard the Pantagruel is filled to the brim with a lot of small details, especially in Reen's interaction with other characters. Let me explain. For example, Reen and Crow have a very interesting dynamic with each other, and it is explored further here with quite a bit of depth. For Reen, Crow is the one that got away. Reen never really got a hold of who Crow really was and got played by him throughout. Also, his conscience is haunted by the fact that one of his friends turned out to be a terrorist and he could only watch because he was too weak. That contributes to his poor self-image. History repeats itself when they fight in Ymir, with Crow getting an easy victory and asserting his far superior skills over Reen. In fact, the placements and postures of their divine knights on the Pantagruel says a lot about their relationship and the power difference between them. But there's more, because from an emotional point of view, Reen feels particularly distant from Crow. He has always been good at judging a person's virtue, and it is exactly because he believes that there is good in Crow that he finds his actions so hard to digest. and that only increases his attraction towards Crow as he develops a strong desire to understand him and his motives. Crow, on the other hand, probably understands everything there is to Reen as a person and cares greatly for him. If nothing else, at least this chapter clarifies Crow's true feelings towards Reen after a bitter final encounter in the first game. The content of Reen's conversations with the other antagonists is also quite fascinating. His interaction with Crow's friends, that is, the Imperial Liberation Front's members, sow the seeds of empathy inside him that later influence how he gets affected by Vulcan's suicide and how he ultimately saves Scarlet from her own suicide attempt. His interactions with Duvali, Scarlet, Ortina, and McBurn act as tiny references of the future in terms of important revelations, organizations, and characters. Reen's interaction with Blue Blanc is particularly interesting because it explores past events, Blue Blanc's relationship with Olivert, and the Courageous gets a mention too. However, from a different point of view, this conversation also acts as a reference to the nearest future, since both Olivert and the Courageous make a surprise appearance in the end of the chapter. Also, talking about future references, Crow also suggests Reen to change Valimar's weapon to a Tachi towards the end of the chapter, which sets up a major portion of the narrative in chapter 2. Regarding Reen's conversation with Alfin, well, I am not going to do it justice here, because I can't. I believe that his relationship with his ogre power and with Elise deserves an entire video on its own. However, I will summarize it by saying that this conversation is deeply insightful, not only regarding the true depth of the relationship between Reen and Elise, but also because it gives a new dimension to Elise, and by showing the ugly side of her love for Reen, elevates her from Reen's angelic and devoted sister to someone more human and empathetic. I do feel like it's reductive to boil the purpose of Aboard the Pantagruel down to simplistic points, because at its heart, the Trails of Cold Steel series is about the nuances and the details, and there are many such details in this chapter which I haven't discussed in the interest of time. That being said, looking at the chapter with respect to the bigger picture will help us understand how the game uses this intermission as a device to boost the narrative of the story. The chapter serves three objectives as the intermission. Firstly, it resolves the past by providing important new details about Reen's relationships with Crow and Elise, thus helping Reen deal with past events and move forward. Secondly, it sets up the future by building a base for many of the future events not only in this game, but in later games in the series as well. For example, it allows the antagonists to tell their sides of the story, which helps us make sense out of some of their actions later in the game. And as I mentioned before, not only sows the seeds of some of Reen's own future actions, but also of future revelations regarding his past. Also, Aboard the Pantagruel is unique and almost inimitable in that the situation presented by the chapter allows for natural interactions with the antagonists, which in turn allows the player to explore their characters and personalities in greater depth. This is the third purpose solved by Aboard the Pantagruel, and I can't think of a more organic way of achieving this effect. It's certainly better than the antagonist inexplicably narrating their life story just before or during a battle with the heroes. I enjoyed the heck out of Aboard the Pantagruel, and this analysis, from the narrative flow to the minute details and to the bigger picture, was first an attempt to explain the reason behind that to myself and then to you guys. And I had to explain it to myself first because I feel like the Trails of Cold Steel games are difficult to analyze, especially if you want to pinpoint the exact reason of why a particular section in the game feels so enjoyable or why a particular scene feels genuinely moving. And that's because there is an absolute wealth of details either in the foreground or background of the scene that the crux of the matter gets buried under. Believe me when I say this, There is not a single wasteful moment or resource in any cutscene on the Pantagruel. The happy background music during the conversation with Scarlet, since she is the only one truly affectionate towards Reen, and Reen getting triggered at Crow being called C because deep inside he refuses to see his friend as a terrorist, are just two of the many minuscule details scattered across the entire chapter. However, it is these very details that provide a sense of completeness and genuine emotional depth and authenticity to a scene, regardless of whether they register subconsciously or consciously. In that sense, Aboard the Pantagruel perfectly encapsulates all that's so good about the storytelling in Trails of Cold Steel.